Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about Belarus in crisis, a story that sits at the crossroads of power, fear, resistance, and the most painful cost of all, the suffering of children caught in the middle of a national struggle. Belarus has long been seen as one of Europe's most tightly controlled states. A country where authority flows from the top down and dissent has often been met with silence or force. For years, stability was the official narrative, but beneath that surface, frustration was growing among citizens, workers, students, and even within institutions once considered unshakably loyal. The crisis did not arrive overnight. It built slowly through contested elections, street protests, and a widening gap between the state and society. When people first filled the streets, many believed change could come through numbers and persistence alone. What followed instead was a deepening confrontation that reshaped the country's political and moral landscape. Security forces were deployed, arrests multiplied, and fear became a daily companion for ordinary families. As protests continued, the conflict began to move beyond civilians versus police and into more dangerous territory. Reports emerged of divisions within the military and security establishment itself. Generals and senior officers, figures traditionally associated with unquestioning loyalty, began to face an impossible choice: obey orders without question or acknowledge that something fundamental had broken. Some chose silence, others doubled down on loyalty, but a few reportedly took a stand that shocked the nation. When generals question authority, it signals a crisis far deeper than street demonstrations. It suggests that the system's internal cohesion is under threat. In Belarus, this possibility alone was enough to send shockwaves through both government and opposition circles. Rumors of resignations, refusals to carry out certain orders, or quiet dissent spread rapidly. Even when officially denied, such stories carried power because they revealed doubt where certainty once ruled. The state responded by tightening control over information. Independent media outlets were shut down, journalists detained, and online platforms restricted. In this environment, truth became fragmented, passed through whispers, encrypted messages, and exile-based reporting. For citizens inside Belarus, uncertainty became as dangerous as open repression. No one knew who could be trusted or how far the state would go next. As tensions escalated, the impact on children became impossible to ignore. Schools, once seen as safe spaces, were affected by the wider atmosphere of fear. Some children witnessed protests firsthand, seeing violence in streets they walked every day. Others experienced trauma indirectly through arrested parents, sudden disappearances, or constant anxiety at home. Children do not need to be targeted directly to suffer. Instability alone is enough to leave lasting scars. There were reports of minors detained during demonstrations, an act that sparked outrage both inside and outside the country. Images and testimonies of young people facing armed officers resonated deeply. For many, this was the moment the crisis crossed a moral line. A state can justify many actions in the name of order, but harming children undermines any claim to legitimacy. Psychologists warned of long-term consequences. Children growing up in fear may struggle with trust, emotional security, and identity. In Belarus, an entire generation risks being shaped by repression rather than hope. Parents faced heartbreaking decisions whether to keep children indoors, send them abroad, or continue daily routines as an act of quiet resistance. The role of the military leadership became increasingly significant. Generals are not just commanders, they symbolize the ultimate enforcement of state power. If they stand fully with the leadership, repression hardens. If they fracture, even slightly, the entire balance shifts. Some reports suggested that certain officers were uncomfortable with being used against civilians. Others feared international consequences, sanctions, and personal accountability. Even hesitation at the top can slow the machinery of repression. The government worked hard to present a unified front. Public appearances emphasized loyalty, discipline, and readiness to defend the state, but unity on camera does not always reflect reality behind closed doors. In authoritarian systems, fear often enforces obedience, but it also breeds resentment. When pressure rises too high, cracks inevitably appear. International reaction added another layer to the crisis. Western governments condemned violence and imposed sanctions on officials and institutions. Neighboring countries watched closely, aware that instability in Belarus could spill across borders. Russia's role was especially critical, as Belarus has long depended on Moscow politically and economically. Support from Russia provided the government with confidence, but it also limited its room to maneuver. For protesters, international attention offered hope, but also frustration. Statements of concern did not always translate into tangible change on the ground. Sanctions hurt the economy, but their impact on daily repression was less clear. Meanwhile, ordinary people bore the cost through rising prices and shrinking opportunities. Children felt these pressures too, as families struggled with uncertainty and reduced income. Inside Belarus, acts of resistance evolved. Large street protests became harder to sustain, but smaller, quieter forms emerged. People used symbols, clothing, and silence itself as tools of dissent. Teachers, doctors, and workers faced pressure to conform, yet some found subtle ways to push back. In schools, this tension was particularly visible. Education became politicized, with loyalty tests and ideological messaging entering classrooms. For children, school was no longer just about learning. It became another arena where fear and conformity were enforced. Those who spoke out, even indirectly, risked punishment. The emotional burden on young minds grew heavier. Stories circulated of children asking difficult questions their parents could not safely answer. Why are people being arrested? Why are soldiers on the streets? Why are friends leaving the country? These questions reveal how deeply the crisis penetrated everyday life. The stand taken by some generals, whether real or rumored, remained a focal point. Even the idea that high-ranking officers might resist unlawful orders inspired many. It suggested that conscience still existed within the system. At the same time, it increased risks for those individuals, as dissent within power structures is rarely forgiven. The crisis also reshaped Belarusian identity. For decades, many citizens felt politically passive, resigned to the system. The events of recent years awakened a sense of agency, even under repression. This awakening came at a high price, but it changed how people saw themselves and their country. Children absorbed this transformation, hearing whispered conversations and seeing acts of courage and fear. Exile became a reality for thousands. Families were split as parents sent children abroad for safety. Living in another country brought its own challenges, including language barriers and cultural shock. For children, exile meant loss of home, friends, and familiarity, yet for many, it was preferable to growing up under constant threat. Those who remained faced a future clouded by uncertainty. What kind of society would emerge from this crisis? Would fear harden into permanent control, or would pressure eventually force change? The answer remains unclear, and that uncertainty is itself damaging. The role of children in this story is not passive. They are not just victims, but witnesses to history. How they remember these years will shape Belarus for decades to come. A generation raised amid repression may either internalize fear or reject it entirely. Which path they take depends on what comes next. For the generals and those in power, history's judgment looms. Orders given today may be scrutinized tomorrow. International courts, public memory, and personal conscience do not forget easily. The decision to stand firm or stand down carries consequences beyond immediate survival. The crisis in Belarus is not just political, it is deeply human. It is about parents trying to protect children. It is about soldiers questioning orders. It is about a society struggling to define right and wrong under pressure. Every act, whether of repression or resistance, adds another layer to the national story. As time passes, the images that endure may not be of speeches or uniforms. They may be of children watching from windows, hearing sirens at night, and learning too early how fragile safety can be. Those images challenge the world to look beyond geopolitics and statistics. They demand attention to the human cost of power struggles. Belarus stands at a crossroads, with no easy path forward. The choices made by leaders, generals, and ordinary citizens will shape its future. Whether the crisis deepens or slowly resolves, its impact will be felt for generations. Children growing up now will one day ask what adults did when it mattered. That question may be the most powerful force of all. As observers, we must remember that behind every headline are real lives. Understanding this crisis means listening to those voices, especially the smallest ones. Only then can we grasp what is truly at stake in Belarus today.